Hi, um, I'm Melanie Sumner. I work at JP Morgan Chase, and I am an accessibility subject matter expert for our Ember project. And today I'm going to talk to you about what I think is a reasonable approach to building accessible applications. I live in Chicago with my husband, my 10-year-old, and our 2 cats. I organize the Ember Chicago meetup. We meet the second Wednesday of every month, so if you're ever in town, please come by. We'd love to have you. I like to play video games when I'm not writing code, Overwatch or Minecraft, or especially Final Fantasy games. I also like to watch Ember videos with my cats. They're very interested in learning Ember, especially Ember engines. One of my cats really likes to help debug, and even tries to help us pick, which file we need. So the goals of this talk: I am not going to include any of the scary stuff today. You will probably all be hearing about lawsuits and regulations and all those kinds of things. I'm not putting those in today because I think there's Google, and I want to encourage you, right? I don't want to scare you. So we're going to talk about what accessibility is and why I think you should care about it. We're going to talk about some obstacles you might face, not only in the workplace, but in your own brain, right? Because we're our own worst enemy sometimes. Then we're going to talk about some practical considerations for doing this and doing it really well. And then we're going to talk about not only how Ember helps you do this, but how you can help Ember do this better. So, accessibility is not a synonym for cross-browser compatibility. If you ever get that question on an interview, please don't say that. It's also not a synonym for tons of extra developer work. Even though reading the spec and looking at all of it, it might feel that way, but no. It answers one question. All of the rules, everything, the spirit of the law is summed up in this one question. Can people of varying ability use the application in the way it was intended to be used? So, why? Math, because math is awesome, so we'll start there. I looked up numbers because I thought, it'd be probably a good idea to have some facts behind this, right? So let's look at how many people are there in the US. So I looked up that number, and then I looked up how many people self-identify as having some sort of disability. And then I looked up and kind of filtered down the numbers for disabilities that may not necessarily affect their relationship with technology. After all that, the numbers came out to about 1 in 10. 1 in 10 of your users will have some sort of disability that will affect their relationship with technology. So, what types of disabilities are those? Different levels of vision. Fully sighted, some limited sight, completely blind. Different types of color blindness. Do we have enough color contrast? Cognitive disorders like ADD, dyslexia, mild dementia even. Repetitive stress injuries. Can they sit and use a computer for a long time? Maybe they have a disability that means they can't use a mouse and keyboard like a traditional setup at all, and they have to use special headgear. And even vestibular disorders, where the user is in a constant state of motion sickness. So you know all that parallax super fun stuff? Nah, Because are our visual designs making our users physically ill? Might be something we want to think about. And there's the law. If you work in financial services, if you work in retail, if you work in state or federal government, or receive any state or government funding for the work that you do, you are required in the US to have an accessible application. Also, there's the good human factor to it, right? Kind of gives you the warm fuzzies that you are doing something good. You're making sure that more people can use your application. Maybe you think this, we don't need to be accessible right now. We'll do it later. Maybe your boss thinks this. Maybe, the person who pays the bills. Here's what I'd like you to consider. Do you like paying more for stuff? You're going to have to do this at least once. Do you really want to pay to do it twice? In my experience, retrofitting your app to be accessible costs just about as much as doing it right the first time, but twice. Because you are going back through and you have to update all the code to be semantic. You have to add in some keyboard stuff. There's some ARIA roles to put in there. And there's a cost to that. So that's an important consideration. How many potential users are you missing out on by ignoring accessibility, even if you don't have to? Is there a financial cost? Is there just a user cost? Like maybe you have a cool product that just is helpful and useful for life, and you've just said 1 in 10 of you can't use it, sorry. Maybe one of your obstacles is that you're the only person who thinks that this is important. I hear this a lot from some junior developers that I mentor. I keep trying to tell them to do it this way. I keep trying to say it's important. So, I have a few pro tips, because I've been doing this a super long time. Look in the mirror and say this: I cannot do this alone. Then I want you to say it again. No, really, I cannot do this alone. Repeat as often as necessary until your brain actually accepts that you cannot do this alone. The good news is you don't have to do this alone. Whose job is it to make an application accessible? Content managers. Your content managers must write clear, simple content. People need to be able to understand the words that they're not only reading, but maybe hearing. User experience designers, they need to design logical, intuitive workflows, well, as much as possible, right? Visual designers need to take color contrast into consideration. Accessible doesn't mean ugly. Accessible is just putting some boundaries in place that help make your application better. Programmers, no matter how you get there, no matter what kind of code you write, it needs to come out as valid code in the end. QA. QA, I don't know about your QA, but my QA has this tendency to sort of do really weird testing things, and they send me these really weird bugs, and I'm like, how did you even think to test for that? Like, really? I've got 5 browser screens up at once, and I want to tab, and then I want to go backwards with arrow keys, and then it got stuck. And So with the use of personas, we're helping to give our QA testers some boundaries for how they should be testing. what should they be thinking about? Because we're not trying to make sure that our app does all the things for everyone at all the time. We're making sure that our app does the right thing for the right user at the right time. Most importantly in this process, we must have the support of our leadership. They're the ones who pay the bills. They're the ones that lead the agenda. We can show them the well-lit path, but without the support of leadership, it simply will be a struggle. It will fall apart. You'll think accessibility is hard and give up. So don't give up, convince leadership. But we're probably mostly developers here, so let's talk about that. The most reasonable advice I can give developers is, please respect the Holy Trinity. And I'm talking about HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. They all do very unique things for very unique reasons, and we use them all together to build awesome things. If it builds, it works, except no. When developers tell me this, we end up having maybe strongly worded conversation, perhaps. Or I just bring cookies, that also works. HTML is like the parent that you always asked, can I go do the thing? Because you knew that parent would be the one that would always say yes. HTML is implicitly error tolerant. Throw everything in divs, sure, it'll still work. You don't have to use HTML the way the spec says to, because it will still work even if you don't. JavaScript, on the other hand, not so much. You do a weird thing, it'll break, it won't build. It says no. Where do you start with accessibility? Ask the question, can users of different abilities use this application in the way it was intended to be used? When I was connecting to the internet, even here, I noticed something and this is something I see all the time on forums. I can never tab to the submit button. When you use the HTML button element, the browser will already allow you to tab to that button. When you put it in a div or a span or something else, unless you've already done the extra work, you can't get to the button. So someone who's a keyboard-only user doesn't even know that the button's there, and they're stuck. They can fill out their name, they can fill out their email address, they can fill out their phone number, whatever, but they can't actually submit the form. So use semantic elements. That's why they're there. Yes, it does take a little bit of, knowing HTML, but it's part of respecting the Holy Trinity, right? It's going to give you a better application anyway. Try not to change the semantic elements if you're going to use them. Use them for the purpose that they're intended. And again, this is, it depends. If you absolutely must, then there's workarounds. But by leveraging the default functionality, you're getting a whole bunch of stuff that's already built into all of the browsers. Where can you start? Start with your keyboard. Tab through your interactive elements to make sure that you can just hit them with the tab button. That's a really good place to just start. Just think about it. Maybe you try that first before diving into the spec. And it's okay to get overwhelmed by that spec. I had to read it like 5 times before I even started understanding the words. It was terrible. But I stuck with it, and it was worth it. And I also figured out that there's a whole bunch of cheat sheets online. So yeah, Makes it easier, who knew? Also, when you use semantic HTML elements, it helps the assistive technology out. This assistive technology is deeply tied to reading the HTML elements and making that work for the screen reader or for whatever it's, voiceover. Firefox and NVDA, Internet Explorer and JAWS, Safari and VoiceOver. These are actually listed in order of my own preference. I don't really like VoiceOver all that much. I think they have a lot of work to do on it. NVDA and Firefox are both free. JAWS is really nice, but the license can get a little pricey, so keep that in mind. And I already talked about that. Okay, so the consequences of not using, say, the button element to make a button. Do you really want to spend your time programming what's going to happen when a user presses enter or space or down arrow or right arrow or up arrow or, okay, I could continue, but I won't, you get the idea. Do you really want to do that? Or do you want to leverage that that's already been done and solve more interesting problems? I don't know about you, but I would rather do the more interesting stuff. Really hate it when people stick me with like the paperwork, right? And I'm sure you do too. So consider that. You get to solve more interesting problems by using semantic HTML. You can also check out the Ember A11Y project. It's a community project whose goal is to bring better tools to Ember developers to help make Ember more accessible out of the box. It's pretty awesome, and it's been really rewarding to get involved in or with. So there's some add-ons you can check out. Ember A11Y is very cool. It helps manage the focus for single-page applications. So, when you load up a web page and you have to start on the top left, and you kind of tab through, if you've ever done that, and to get to what you're doing. And then you go to a new page, and then you have to tab up from the top left and get to what you're doing again. With this add-on, the focus stays to the relevant context for the user, based on their routes, right? So they're going to their inbox. They're going to check a specific message. The focus will stay on what is relevant for that user at that time, giving them a better user experience. Ember A11Y testing is built on the Axe Core API. And what this does is tells you if you have any syntax errors in your ARIA accessibility kind of code. It helps you fix your code before you even push it to your code base. The thing is, roles, ARIA roles, they're not like CSS classes. You can't just make them up. I know because I've had developers try to do that. There's a specific set of rules, right? And what it does is it tells you, no, you can't use that rule. Here's the rule that you need to use, actually. So it tells you what's wrong and how to fix it, which I think is really useful. And then Ember CLI template lint, which helps with testing to assert that your styles have been used. You can join the topic A11Y channel on Slack and just ask questions if you have them and get help. So in our journey to building accessible applications, we have the legal requirements, which is legal compliance. We have WCAG 2.0 that gives us the conformance aspects. What are the rules we need to follow, the specific rules? But really what we're all working towards, or I think we should be working towards, is a culture of accessibility. Ember, the Ember community seems to have these great, not seems to have, does have, these really great principles of diversity and inclusion. And that's what accessibility is about. By building accessible applications, we're living out those values in our code. We're making sure that we're not excluding users because of their disability. Also, it ends up informing and enhancing the visual design and user experience. I deal with a lot of, not a lot, but every once in a while, oh, if I have to make it accessible, it's going to be so ugly. Except no. We're not trying to tell you exactly, make it just black and white. I, as you can see, tend to prefer black and white. But our goal is to say, hey, here's the fence. Be as creative as you want within that fence. Go for it. And it gives better parameters for success because we've outlined sort of the structure where the success needs to, and the creativity needs to happen. And I think by building accessible applications and thinking in this way, it ends up becoming part of not only our code by default, but who we are. We become more compassionate not only towards ourselves, but to other people. We are able to think bigger than just our sphere of influence. We're able to consider all the different kinds of people who come to use this incredible thing that we built with Ember, or whatever we use. And that's pretty cool. Are there any questions? Oh, let me see. Okay, so our two cats are Atlas and Peabody from the Portal video game. We really love that game. Gladys is my spirit animal. So this is Peabody, and he likes the dryer, and I try to keep it shut, but one day he jumped in, and I thought, oh, that's really cute. So,
I have a question about, so you mentioned semantic elements a couple times, and web components have names, but which seems like semantic to like, the lazy version of a developer who's been learning HTML. The difference in between old tags in HTML4 and the new semantic was in HTML5 is mostly that they have meaningful names at our level. But obviously that doesn't really apply to web components where the actual meaning is defined all in JavaScript. So is there anything that the accessibility standards have to say about that? And maybe also about shadow DOM, where parts of the DOM are supposed to be hidden, so like screen readers wouldn't see your input inside of your fancy input or something like that. Like, how does that work?
Sure. Okay, so this is one of the reasons why I kind of kid glove this talk with especially JavaScript engineers, because sort of the coolness of JavaScript is you can make it do all the things. And I'm not I'm not advocating to not do that. Go for it. I'm saying when that is pushed, when that is rendered on the browser, you can still, even as many components as you build, you can still define those tag names. You can still make sure that it renders valid HTML in the browser. Now, should you choose to not do that, you're missing out on a lot of benefits. You can still put divs everywhere, but there's a lot of extra ARIA properties that you're going to have to go in and add, and that takes a lot of time, where if you're using the semantic one, it does take learning HTML5, but I think that's just like anything that we do as web developers. It's not a bad thing that we have to sit down and become experts in the technology that we're trying to use to build applications. Also, about fancy inputs, there's an ARIA hidden property, and you can use that when you want to do something fancy. You also just have to make sure that you put all of that base functionality into the special thing that you're doing. So it is possible. Also, ARIA 1.1 is coming out soon, just come out, something like that. We're very close. And this one seems like they've given us, specifically JavaScript framework engineers, a lot of really useful tools where we're going to be able to kind of say, this was what this div is intended to do. So we're going to be able to convey a lot more intent with the new properties that are coming out, and that's incredibly useful.
Actually, on semantic elements again. Just on using semantic elements, are there specific elements that maybe like pack more of a punch? You get more bang for your buck if you like go after field elements and buttons first and leave sections and articles secondary? Are there certain that are better to go after first?
Absolutely. Your inputs, any interactive elements, that's really important to just take care of first. I would really recommend just starting there. Making sure that you could, that's why I suggested try tabbing through your app first, just to see, can I hit that button? Or did I do a weird thing and I didn't use the button? So that's how that, I would suggest that approach first.
Questions? Luke?
Thanks for this talk. A question about when you're done. How do you know when you're done in this stuff?
That's a good question. I haven't gotten there yet. Your tests, right? Your tests are not going to throw errors. I think as we develop our applications, right, we're kind of, I don't know about you, but I kind of parent my apps. When I'm building an app, it's kind of, I'm the mom of that app while I have that app. I use it. I think about ways other people are going to use it. Mostly because of my weird QA, but I'll put on a headset and I'll use NVDA and I'll see what the experience is like. When you can answer that question, can people of varying abilities use this app the way I've designed and intended it to be used? Now this means you have to be on purpose. You need to clearly define what you're trying to do and what you're not trying to do. By giving yourself those parameters, you're setting yourself up for success from the start. Because you're saying, we're trying to do this specific thing. Anything else kind of falls outside of that. And maybe that can be, one of those outside things can become a future enhancement. And you can kind of grandfather that in and sort of work towards that also being included. But I really think it's very important to do that. But I don't think that's an accessibility thing. I think that's just being a good developer thing, right? So.
I have a question.
Okay.
Do you have any examples of maybe applications that are publicly accessible online that we can go and look at that do it really well?
That's a very good question. If you go look up Google WAI-ARIA, A-R-I-A, they have a website, and their website's completely accessible. And that's a really good place to start, I think, just seeing how that works. Now, my problem with it is not really pretty. I think they could have done a little bit more, had a little bit more care with visual design. But I think that's, maybe a limitation of volunteers, right? We do have a demo app that we're working on for the Ember A11Y project, but it's not quite there yet.
Quick question on custom element, like the V1 spec has this is equals and the name of your component, so you could still use button. And up to now, I hadn't thought about why I would really want that, but that kind of makes a lot of sense now. So with JavaScript, you could still create custom elements, but still in your HTML use the button. Will that kind of just jive with you know, the A11Y methodology of just keeping with the semantic element and still kind of being able to, you know, define custom elements at the same time?
You know, Nathan, do you have any input on that? I don't think I know.
Because the is equals is kind of like nutty, but yeah, I'll stop there.
Sorry to put you on the spot.
So the HTML spec is equals is actually being debated pretty hotly as to whether or not it will be included. The accessibility aspects of it are very positive. It gives the default browser whatever supplied semantics to a custom element. It allows you to extend from a built-in element without using some declarative JavaScript API. So there's a lot of possible benefits there. I can't speak to how it's going to actually work in reality, given that most people have kind of stepped back, or most browsers have stepped back from the custom elements implementations at this point in time, because there's so much complexity over the imports API and asynchronously loading things. And we're discovering that a lot of the concerns can actually be addressed in userland code with frameworks. So I'd say that's a place to watch, and that the is attribute is probably going to be a very important part of accessibility in the future if it manages to stick around.
Any other questions? All right.
I actually have two questions. So one is, and you touched on it, that accessible doesn't mean just designing for screen readers and people that are visually impaired. Of the 10% of the population that you mentioned, do you know how many are disabled because they're visually impaired? I would guess it's below 50%, and that's commonly what we think of. Second question is, and I don't know if you mentioned this, are there any tools to, say, prevent building your app if it doesn't meet whatever rules you might have in place, like 508 compliance? Or is that maybe a feature of one of the A11 add-ons?
Okay. So Ember E11Y testing gives you a very immediately visual, oh my gosh, there's something wrong. We put these really obnoxious stripes on the component, so it's like you can't ignore it, right? And it's actually kind of jarring, and we actually have different levels of how irritating do you want this to be. Because I told one of the guys in the project, like, I can't sell this in enterprise land if it like makes it look too bad. Like, we need to soften this blow a little bit. That's one of the really useful things about it, is you can immediately, oh, there's something wrong here, and then go look and see what that is. As far as what the different numbers are for the different types of disabilities, I think it was the CDC website that I got this information from to begin with, and they actually break down the different disabilities, which is why I was able to filter out ones that wouldn't have affected a user's relationship with technology. So you could look at those numbers specifically.
Oh.
Just out of curiosity, I know I'm colorblind, and I never think of that as a disability that I would like tell the government that I'm disabled because I'm colorblind. Mm-hmm. How do you get how do you look that up, and how do you, I mean, how would you say how would you deal with disabilities that people don't think of as disabilities?
So you're right. There are some self-reporting statistics. These are people that have self-identified as having a disability. I'm pretty sure that the CDC pulls their data not only from us as self-identifying people, but maybe insurance companies give them some of that information, or public health records, or I think there's a lot of ways to get that information, right? How many people do you have? How many people have said, I have a color blindness issue? But there's probably a lot more that don't self-identify. Probably a lot of people that just figure that's just the way things are, no big deal, right? So, yeah, the numbers are not 100% accurate, but I don't think they ever will be.
More questions? All right. Thank you so much.